200 men on horseback. Caleb Holt counted them from his porch. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't run inside. He just stood there, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the largest group of armed men he'd ever seen in his life form a line across the ridge above his property. 24 hours earlier, he had given water to a wounded stranger he found bleeding at the edge of his land. He didn't ask who the man was, didn't ask what had happened. He just gave him water. And now 200 men were on his ridge. What happened in the next 3 days would become the most talked about story in 3 counties. And it would start with one question. Was the water worth it? This channel tells the stories of the men and women who built Texas with their hands and their honor. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss what happens next. Southwest Texas, 1883. The kind of land that doesn't apologize for what it is. No trees to speak of, no shade that lasts. Water scarce enough that men have killed for less than a bucketful. The Rio Grande ran brown and low that summer. Every ranch within 40 miles knew it. Caleb Holt had come to this land 12 years earlier with a mule, a saddle, and $70 he'd earned driving cattle up from San Antonio. He hadn't come looking for easy. He'd built his ranch post by post, acre by acre. Not the biggest spread in the county, not the richest, but every inch of it was his. 44 years old, never married, no family within 3 days' ride. Just him, 2 ranch hands, and 800 head of cattle that he knew by sight. In 12 years on that land, Caleb Holt had seen outlaws, floods, drought, and a cattle fever that killed half his herd in one summer. He had survived all of it. He had survived because he followed one rule. Mind your own business. Help who needs helping. Don't invite trouble. And never, under any circumstances, leave a man dying at your fence line. That last part was about to cost him everything, or give him something he never expected. The evening of July 14th started the same as every other. Caleb rode his fence line at dusk. 4 miles east, 3 miles north, 4 miles west, 3 miles south. The same loop he'd ridden 6,000 times. He checked posts for rot, checked wire for breaks. The kind of work that never ended and never stopped mattering. At the southeast corner, near the dry creek bed, he found a post that had worked loose in the last rain. He tied off his horse and crouched to reset it. That's when he heard it. Not loud, not obvious. A sound between a groan and something trying not to be a groan. He followed it to the creek bed. The man was on his back in the dry brush. Mexican, by his clothes and the cut of his hat, now lying 3 feet from his head where it had fallen. Shot twice, once in the shoulder, once in the upper leg. Neither wound was instantly fatal. Both were fatal given time and heat and no water. Caleb looked at the man, looked at the ridge to the south. Dust rising maybe 2 miles back. Could be wind. Could be riders. He pulled his canteen and held it to the man's lips. The man drank without speaking. When he'd had enough, he looked at Caleb with eyes that had seen too much of a certain kind of world to show surprise at much of anything. "You don't know who I am," the man said. Not a question. "No," Caleb said. "Don't need to." He got the man onto his horse, rode back to the ranch with him, draped across the saddle. His 2 ranch hands, Dewey and Abe, came out of the barn to see. Neither of them said what they were thinking. They'd worked for Caleb long enough to know when to keep a thought behind their teeth. They got the man inside. Caleb cleaned the wounds with what he had, bound them tight, put the man in the spare room that had always been a spare room because Caleb had never needed it for anything else. "Don't ask him anything," Caleb told them. "Don't tell anyone he's here." Dewey and Abe exchanged a look, but they nodded. That night, Caleb sat on his porch and watched the darkness. The dust he'd seen on the southern ridge had settled. Whatever had been moving out there had stopped. Or was waiting. The man's name, when he finally gave it, was Ernesto Vega. He offered it like a man handing over something he wasn't sure he should hand over. Watching Caleb's face for a reaction that would tell him whether the name meant what he thought it meant. Caleb's face gave him nothing, because the name meant nothing. In a county that big, with a border that long, there were a lot of names a man could carry. Most of them didn't travel as far north as Caleb's ranch. Ernesto studied him for a long moment. Then he told him the rest. He had crossed the Rio Grande 4 days earlier, not for the first time, not for the last time he'd hoped. He had a message to deliver to a man in Laredo, a message from someone whose name Caleb also wouldn't recognize, and that anonymity was by design. The men who shot him had been following him since the crossing. He'd lost them in the brush country east of the river, or thought he had. "They want the message," Ernesto said. "Not just me, the message." Caleb looked at him. "You have it on you?" Ernesto said nothing, which was an answer. Caleb stood at the window and looked at his land. 800 cattle, 2 good horses, 4 years of fence wire, everything he had built in 12 years of early mornings and late nights. "How many men were following you?" he asked. Ernesto hesitated. That hesitation was its own answer. "Enough," Ernesto said finally. "Enough that you should know what you've gotten yourself into." "I know what I've gotten into," Caleb said. "Man needed water. I gave it. That's not a complicated situation." Ernesto looked at him for a long time. Something shifted in his face. Not gratitude exactly. Something older than gratitude. Recognition. That night Caleb didn't sleep. Neither did Dewey or Abe. They took turns on the porch, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, rifles resting across their knees. Nothing came. No riders, no sound of hooves, no shadows crossing the moonlit grass. By 3 in the morning, Caleb was starting to think the danger had passed. That Ernesto's pursuers had lost the trail for good. That by morning he could get the man back on a horse and pointed toward Laredo, and that would be the end of it. He heard Ernesto moving in the spare room, knocked once and entered. Ernesto was sitting up, looking out the narrow window that faced south. "They're out there," he said. "Not afraid, just certain." Caleb looked. Nothing visible. Pure dark. "How do you know?" The coyotes stopped. Caleb listened. The coyotes had been calling all night, back and forth across the brush. Now, silence. The kind of silence that happens when something larger than a coyote is moving through the same land. He woke Dewey and Abe without raising his voice. They positioned themselves at the 4 windows, and they waited. An hour passed. 2. The first gray light of dawn began to show at the eastern edge of the sky, and with it, shapes. At first, Caleb thought it was cattle, his cattle, moved overnight by some disturbance. But cattle don't sit that still. He raised his field glass. Riders, dozens of them, spread across the ridge in a line that stretched further than the glass could show. He lowered the glass, turned to Ernesto. "You said enough. How many is enough?" Ernesto looked out at the ridge. His expression wasn't what Caleb expected. It wasn't fear. It was something Caleb couldn't name. Not yet. 200 men. Caleb counted what he could see and estimated the rest. They weren't advancing. They weren't retreating. They were simply there, lined along the ridge of his property, waiting for something he didn't understand yet. One rider broke from the group, came down the slope at a walk. No hurry, no aggression. The way a man rides when he's already decided how the meeting will go. Caleb stepped off the porch. He didn't pick up his rifle. 200 men on a ridge made a rifle a gesture, not a defense. The rider was older than Caleb expected. 60s, maybe. White hair beneath a black hat. The kind of face that had made 1,000 decisions and lived with all of them. He stopped 30 yards out and studied Caleb the way a man studies a map he's never seen before. Careful, thorough. Neither man spoke for a full minute. Then the old rider turned his head slightly toward the house. "My son," he said. "He is inside?" Caleb understood then what Ernesto's expression had been. Not fear, not guilt, relief. He had known, at some level, that being found at this ranch meant being found by his father. "He's inside," Caleb said. "He's going to be fine." Something shifted in the old man's shoulders, not dramatically, just slightly. The way a man's body responds to news it was bracing against. He dismounted, walked toward Caleb, stopped 10 feet away. "You found him," the old man said. "Yes." "You gave him water?" "Yes." "You brought him inside?" "Yes." The old man was quiet for a moment. He looked at Dewey and Abe on the porch, looked at the house, looked at Caleb. "Why?" he asked. Caleb thought about it. Not for long. "He needed water. I had water." The old man turned and looked back at the ridge. 200 riders. Still waiting. Then he looked back at Caleb. "I am Rodrigo Vega," he said. The name landed in the air between them. Even 40 miles from the border, even in a county that minded its own business as a point of pride, that name had traveled. Rodrigo Vega, the man who controlled every crossing between Del Rio and Eagle Pass. The man 3 Texas sheriffs had warrants for and none of them had served. The man whose son Caleb had pulled from a dry creek bed and given water to. Caleb met his eyes. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know," Rodrigo said, "what it means that I am standing here." Rodrigo Vega walked into Caleb's house without asking permission, not as an act of disrespect, as an act of a man who had stopped needing to ask for things a long time ago. He stood in the doorway of the spare room. Ernesto looked up at him. The exchange between them was the kind that happens in families over decades, compressed into a single look. Too much to say, too much history, too much weight. They spoke quietly in Spanish. Caleb waited in the hall. He couldn't hear what was being said. He didn't need to. Dewey appeared at the end of the hall, raised his eyebrows in the silent question that needed no words. Caleb shook his head slightly. Not yet. After 20 minutes, Rodrigo came back into the hall. He looked at Caleb with the same measuring gaze he'd used outside. "My men," he said. "They have been on that ridge since before dawn. They are hungry and they are tired and some of them are angry." "Angry at me?" Caleb asked. "Angry at the situation. Some of them would have preferred to ride down here last night and take my son by force." "Why didn't they?" "Because I told them not to." "A man who gives water to a stranger in the dark," Rodrigo said, "without asking why or what it will cost him, is not a man whose house you ride into with guns." "That is not respect," Rodrigo continued. "That is intelligence. A man like that is either very brave or very dangerous. Either way, you don't make him your enemy without reason." "I didn't think of it that way," Caleb said. "I know," Rodrigo said. "That's exactly the point." He stood at the window for a long moment. "The men who shot my son," he said quietly, "they will come back. Not today, but soon. And when they do," Rodrigo said, "they won't care whose land this is." Caleb looked at his land, the land that had cost him 12 years, the land that was everything he had. "How many?" he asked. "Fewer than 200, Rodrigo said. "But enough. They came from the north, not 200, 11. Men who had ridden hard and didn't care who knew it. Their horses were lathered. Their faces were tight with the particular tension of men who had been told to find something and were close to finding it. Rodrigo watched them from the window. There they are, he said, quietly, like a man who had been right about something he wished he'd been wrong about. The riders pulled up at the gate. The leader was a lean man in a gray coat. He looked at the house, looked at the barn, looked at the ridge where 200 men still sat on horseback. That last part gave him pause. Caleb came out on the porch alone. No rifle, no Dewey, no Abe. Just himself, standing at the edge of his own boards on his own land. The lean man in gray studied the situation the same way he'd been trained to study situations. Looking for exits, looking for ambush, looking for the angle he was missing. He walked his horse to within 50 feet. "I'm looking for a Mexican man," he said. "Wounded. Crossed north a few days ago." Caleb said nothing. "There's a reward for information," the man said. "Substantial one." Still nothing from Caleb. The lean man leaned forward in his saddle. "This doesn't have to involve you," he said. "You tell me what I need to know and we ride on. Simple as that." Caleb looked at the ridge. 200 men, still and patient as the land itself. Then he looked back at the 11. The decision had been made at a dry creek bed 48 hours ago. He just hadn't known it at the time. "Don't have any information for you," Caleb said. "Don't have any strangers on my land. Just me, my hands, and my cattle." The lean man in gray looked at Caleb for a long moment, looked at the ridge again. Did the math that any reasonable man would do. He turned his horse without another word. The 11 riders followed him north. Caleb watched them until the dust settled. When he turned around, Rodrigo was standing in the doorway. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That evening, Rodrigo Vega sat on Caleb Holt's porch. For the first time in 3 days, the ridge to the north was empty. The 200 riders had gone. Not disappeared. Gone back across the river. Back to where they'd come from. The two men sat in silence for a while. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Rodrigo reached inside his coat, pulled out an envelope. He held it out to Caleb. Caleb looked at it, didn't take it. "What I did," Caleb said. "I did because it was the right thing, not because of what it might be worth." Rodrigo held it there a moment longer. Then he put it back. "I have dealt with many men," Rodrigo said finally. "In my work, in my life. Most men do what is right when it costs them nothing. A few do what is right when it costs them something small. Very few do what is right when it could cost them everything. You didn't know who my son was. You didn't know who would come looking. You gave him water because he needed it. That kind of man," Rodrigo said, "should not have enemies." He stood, adjusted his hat, looked once more at the empty ridge. "The men in gray coats," he said. "They won't come back. You have my word on that." Caleb nodded. Rodrigo walked to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. He looked at Caleb one last time. Then he rode south. Caleb watched until he was gone. Then he sat back down in his chair, picked up his coffee. It had gone cold again. He drank it anyway. 3 weeks passed. The men in gray coats did not come back. Dewey and Abe went back to their regular work. The post that Caleb had been fixing when he found Ernesto was properly set now. The fence was whole again. A letter arrived, no return address, brought by a rider who left before Caleb could ask him anything. Inside, in careful English, written by someone who had learned it as a second language. "The water you gave was not forgotten. If your land or your cattle are ever threatened, send word south. There will be men who remember." No signature. Caleb folded it, put it in his shirt pocket. He went back to work, fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been loose for a month. The ranch grew over the years, not because of anything Rodrigo Vega did, Because Caleb Holt was the kind of man who worked until things grew. But in 12 more years of living on that land, no one ever brought trouble to his fence line. No rustlers, no drought riders, no men in gray coats. Whether that was coincidence or something else, Caleb never said. He wasn't a man who needed to explain things that had already been settled. There's a version of this story that's easy to tell. Rancher helps stranger. Stranger's powerful father shows up grateful. Everyone goes home safe. That version is true. It's also incomplete. The real story is about what happened at a dry creek bed before any of it. Before Caleb knew who Ernesto was. Before he knew who was looking for him. Before he had any idea what giving that water would cost or return. He gave water to a man who needed it. That's all. No calculation, no angle, no thought about what it might be worth. In a place like Southwest Texas in 1883, that kind of uncalculated decency was rarer than water itself. It's rarer now than most people want to admit. 200 men on a ridge is a terrifying thing. But 200 men who came to see what kind of person you are and rode away satisfied, that's something different. That's a verdict. Rodrigo Vega brought 200 men to Caleb Holt's land. He didn't bring them to threaten. He brought them because when his son was hurt and lost, one man had done the right thing without being asked. And Rodrigo needed to see, with his own eyes, what kind of man does that. Caleb Holt never thought of himself as brave. He thought of himself as someone who minded his own business and helped when help was needed. It turned out those were the same thing, and it turned out the frontier had a way of finding out which men were which. Water doesn't lie, and neither does what you do when you find someone who needs it. Every day, this channel tells another story from the frontier, where honor was the only currency that mattered. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the spirit of the Texas frontier. If it stayed with you, subscribe, leave a comment. What would you have done at that creek bed? The next story is already waiting for you on screen.